Okay. И видели по-русски еще или нет? И это по-русски. Не могу. Okay, fine.
Вам нужно настроить на первый канал. Это русский канал.
Very quickly introduce you, but
No, just
not
keep it.
listening everything.
No, for God's sake, don't do that. Don't do that. It'd be terrible.
You're doing so right.
No. Can I run till 2:10? Can I?
Sure. Уважаемые коллеги, добрый день. Очень рада вас видеть в аудитории на одном из наших курсов. Я надеюсь, вы получаете удовольствие от курса. Вот почти все кивнули по старой позиции. У нас с вами сегодня гостевая лекция Стюарта Лоусона. Его биография настолько очень интересная, что я даже ее не буду вам пересказывать. Он это сделает намного лучше, чем я.
Да, спасибо.
Несомненно. Человек, у которого, несомненно, очень много всем мы можем поучиться. Поэтому давайте поприветствуем Стюарта.
Ну, спасибо большое. Ну, добрый день. Я говорю очень плохо по-русски. Это лучше, если я говорю по-английски. Put them on. My name is Stuart Lawson. It's very nice to be here today. Let me tell you a little bit about my background. Believe it or not, I've been in Russia 20 years. Почему я не говорю по-русски? I've been here 20 years. I set up Citibank. I was the first president of Citibank in Russia in 1995. And I spent 25 years with Citibank, and I worked with them in 11 countries around the world. England, Scotland, Kenya, Greece, Egypt, France, Norway, Italy, Russia, Puerto Rico, and America. I hope this is not too fast. And I was their crisis manager from 1982 until 2000. I was their crisis manager because they discovered that I actually enjoyed being at the bottom of the business cycle. So for much of my career, I went from one bottom of one business cycle to the bottom of the next business cycle. And then eventually I was given the opportunity of becoming the president of Citibank in Russia. And I discovered in 1995 that I love your country. And I loved the environment, the business opportunities, the cultural environment, and the people. And I realized that my future was going to be here in this country, and therefore I left Citibank in 2000, and I became the chairman of Delta Bank, a small bank. I was then asked by Khodorkovsky to be the chairman of Menatet Bank, and when he went to jail, I got the hint it was obviously not going to happen in a way that I wanted it to, so I joined Deripaska, the owner of Russian Aluminium, and I was his banker for 4 years until I became the chairman of HSBC Bank, which you may know is one of the world's largest banks, and they were launching retail and private banking here in Russia, and that was my job, to launch them, which we did in 2009. In 2010, they decided to close. That's a sort of longer story. And I then joined Ernst & Young, which is one of the big four. Actually, it's now EY. It's not Ernst & Young, but it's one of the big four accounting firms. And I've been there for 4 years. I'm an executive director, and I help them in bank advisory and in their general development of their brand here in Russia. And I know that you're doing project management at the moment, and I would actually like to talk a little bit about what I've experienced in project management, because of course launching a retail bank is a very good example of project management. I was also involved in other of my operations, for instance, running Bank Soyuz for Deripaska. That was a project by itself. It was a beginning, a middle, and unfortunately an end to that particular project. But that's not the focus of today's discussion. And what I will try and do is make sure that we finish this part of the discussion with enough time that we can talk about anything you want to talk about. And that includes project management, or includes anything about the role of a CEO, or even how a foreigner looks at the Russian business environment, anything at all. And the more questions, the better. But before we get to that, I want to talk about something very close to my heart. You will no doubt have had the opportunity to listen to or to read books about how to be successful. The fact that you're in this room, the fact you're here in this university, already demonstrates that you want to be successful. And I fundamentally hope that you are. I mean, that's what we all want. But what I want to talk about today is something that you're going to have to deal with one way or another. And I'm sure that you may be thinking, no, not me. I'm not going to fail. It's not going to happen to me. Well, let's see. Let me tell you a little story. And let's see if this thing works. Well, I'm pointing it. Oh, there we go. There is enough. I'm sorry. You will have these slides in Russian. I need them because my Russian's so bad that if they were in Russian, I wouldn't know what I was talking about. There is enough talk here about success. But at some point in your career, probably when you are least expecting it, probably at that point in your career where the sky is blue and the sun is shining, it is at that point you will fail. This is not a curse. I am not some voodoo witch cursing you all to failure. I'm talking about something that life delivers. And if you, like me, are not expecting it when it happened to me, it is extremely inefficient. It is extremely damaging, not because you failed, but because the way that you manage that failure can soak up a huge amount of your time, energy, emotion. And what I want to do in the next 45 minutes is to tell you my story and what I learned from my failures. But before I start, I want to tell you a quick story. I gave this lecture for the first time 2 years ago at Oxford University, Said College. And I was quite nervous because this was the first time in a public environment I talked about my failures. But I decided this was an important topic and I really wanted to pass it on. So I gave the lecture, and immediately after the lecture, somebody put their hand up, question and answer. And the first question was, Mr. Lawson, that was very interesting, but you used to be a CEO and now you're teaching us about failure. Doesn't that mean you failed? Because you can understand that they were saying, well, if you were really successful, you'd still be in a big corner office in a big building, being very powerful, making lots of decisions day to day. But here you are in our classroom telling us that we should learn how to fail. Let me assure you, nobody in their right mind would stand in front of a group of intelligent people talking about their failures if their self-image was failure. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to justify why I feel successful. You'll just have to take it from me that I have a very broad, interesting life behind me and an even more interesting life ahead of me, and that to me defines success. Now, let's talk about this failure business. First of all, let me sell myself to you. 35 years a banker. You're going to want to hire me at the end of this. 35 years a banker in 11 countries. CEO of two of the world's largest in Russia. Ran banks for two of the most influential. Of course, you may say Mr. Hodorkovsky isn't influential today. I'm not that. But when I joined him, he was certainly influential. So, and Deripaska remains influential. Nominated Russia's leading banker 4 years in a row. Not by some magazine that I paid to nominate me, but actually by the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. So the real thing. Leading expatriate commentator on Russia, here I am. Lost 5 jobs. And when I say I lost 5 jobs, I don't mean, I mean actually I went through the process of somebody saying thank you very much and goodbye. And there were different reasons for each of them. Obviously, you could say Mr. Hodorkovsky said thank you very much and goodbye because he was in jail. Is that my problem? Well, it wasn't my problem, it was his problem. But I still lost the job. At Citibank, I thought that I was going to be at Citibank for the rest of my life. I was there 25 years. But at some point in the process, I realized my future was here, not there, so I lost that job. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I lost five jobs. Critically, I found 6. And it's not about the loss of the job, it's about finding the next one that's critical. You get it? Success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose. Success actually, in a way, is quite damaging. When I say it's quite damaging, I mean it doesn't teach you how to be a better person. It teaches you, it reinforces what you're doing. It works so far, I've been successful so far, so I'll just keep doing the same. And lots of times that's fine. Failure, on the other hand, is a teacher, if you treat it right. This was me. I was on my private jet. I was with the CEO of Citibank, John Reed, on his private jet. He was flying me in his helicopter. We were cooking steaks at his house. And suddenly, I got the 25-year clock, which was a grandfather clock, no use, by the way, when you're about to move from one country to another, and a set of papers saying, thank you very much for your 25 years and goodbye. How could they do this to me? Well, of course, partly it was my decision. But there was no great ceremony. In fact, one of my principal objectives at EY is to make sure I have a proper farewell party, because I've never had one, really. I have no intention of leaving in the short term, but when I do leave, I'm going to have a huge party. When you get into the failure mode, welcome to the spin cycle. Your life is in motion, and not in a good way. Actually, it's a bit like being a mushroom. You're in a dark place, and shit is shoveled over. I don't know if that translates. Shit is shoveled over you on a regular basis. That's how you feel about life. That is the process of failure. And it is very tempting at that point to allow yourself to roll around in this situation. And what I want to do today is to tell you why that's not a good thing. But before we get there, I want to talk about what leadership is. You see, I made a mistake because I was one of Citibank's leading crisis managers. And the emphasis is on the word manager. I managed people in a very directive way. And if you're a crisis manager, and if we talked about crisis management, which I'd love to come back and talk to you about, one of the things that crisis management requires is shortened lines of communication, quicker cycle time, more directive leadership. when the house is on fire, you don't ask the people who may have lit the fire, what shall we do? You tell them what they need to do to put the fire out. And because I was moving from country to country in situations where somebody else had lit the fire, frankly, I wasn't listening to what their point of view was, because whatever it was had caused the fire to start. So the first thing I want to make the point about is there is a really big difference between management and leadership. Question: are leaders born, or are they bred? What do you think? Who thinks that leaders are born? Put your hands up. One person. But that's because you think you're a born leader. So does that mean everybody else thinks that they're bred? Hands up. Okay, so some of you don't. Well, that's more. But some of you apparently don't think they're either born or bred. And I think actually they're both. I feel, for instance, that some people have an easier road to leadership. Some people have within them leadership characteristics. My favorite example, because I'm British, is Churchill. Churchill was a complete disaster. He was never elected to an office of government. He was appointed. He, in the 30s, was completely irrelevant. But his moment came, and he had in him the qualities of leadership, of courage, integrity, the ability to communicate. And the environment gave him that opportunity to flourish. But other people, I believe, come to this more in a different way. They come to it because they're put in situations where leadership is almost forced on them. And in those situations, I certainly believe that their experience creates their characteristics that allow them to be leaders. It's just some people, so I actually agree with you, some people are born, but I don't think, even if you're born with leadership potential, you still need the environment to bring that out of you. Now, in leadership, some elements can be taught. These are skills. Communication, external and internal. If I can't communicate my ideas, if the gentleman there in the kiosk disappeared and I tried to communicate with you in my terrible Russian, my ability to communicate my leadership would be significantly damaged. So you have to be able to communicate. And you have to be able to do this both verbally and in written form. But the fact is, some situations may require more or less of that communication. There are other skills. As a leader, the most important task, one of your most important tasks, is how to create your team. Because leadership is nothing more complicated, really, than being able to leverage your own capacity. If you can't cause other people to want to follow you and to want to do what you want them to do, but for their reasons, then you're not going to be able to have a greater span of control. You will be as good as your direct control, but you won't be able to leverage it to create true leadership. So judging a good team is a critical skill. You need to be able to coach and interact with people. You need to know how to run a meeting. What's the most important thing in running a meeting? What do you think? Ja понимаю по-русски, я могу слушать. What is the most important? What do you think is the most important thing in a meeting? Да, это без проблем. And we don't know. Stuart, what is the most important thing in running a meeting? Communicating. Нужен agenda. You need to have an agenda. You can't. The biggest problem with a meeting is having a meeting to have a meeting. You need to have an agenda for your meeting. You need to inform people beforehand. You need to manage the actual time of the meeting. When does it start? When does it finish? And most important of all, you need to be able to make decisions at that meeting. And to have those decisions have two key elements. Three. What it is, what the topic is, who's responsible for it, and when they have to execute it by. If you only have one or two of those elements, then you've just had a meeting to have a meeting. And there's no forward momentum. The only way you create forward momentum is by having the topic clearly defined, by having the person that's going to lead it clearly defined, and by having a deadline clearly defined. But there's no point in doing any of that if you haven't told people what you're going to talk about beforehand and given them enough information to be informed. So, mini class in how to do a meeting. I can teach this. Time management, I can teach it. Always make your meetings 45 minutes so that you have 15 minutes of run over time until you have the next meeting. Never be late, especially for your own meetings. Time management, simple things. Oops. It takes time, perseverance, and practice to learn these skills. This is the interesting thing. You see, some of the things you need for leadership cannot be taught because they are characteristics. They're not skills. And what are these characteristics? This is not a comprehensive list. This is simply a set of characteristics that I believe are important in leadership. Integrity. Speak the truth. Speak your truth. Be a person who is credible. Please come on in, don't worry. Commitment. There is no such thing as a part-time leader. If people don't smell your commitment, they won't follow you. Hey, judgment and wisdom. Try teaching that. You can't teach wisdom. You can't teach judgment. You get there by making mistakes and by making the right decisions and by making the wrong decisions. And that's how you create judgment. Patience and impatience. If you only have patience, you'll never create momentum. Hey, whatever, do it whenever you feel like. It's no big deal. You can't have that. But equally, you can't tell somebody, well, why didn't you do this? I gave it to you yesterday. Why haven't you done it yet? If you do that, you lose the connectivity between you and the people you're leading. And once you've lost that connectivity, it's very difficult to regain it. This one, perseverance, is linked to that one, courage. And it's at the core, I believe, of a lot of learning in leadership, which is you need to be able to pick yourself up and keep going. Actually, it's pretty easy to be successful. I don't mean that lightly. I mean, if things are going well and you make the right decisions and you're supported by senior management and you're a rock star, and I was a rock star in business terms. I don't look like a rock star. It's easy. The problem comes when you have your setback. And it's at that point that I judge people as to whether or not they have the right stuff to become leaders. Patton, I think, General Patton said, I don't judge a man by whether he's knocked down. I judge him by how he picks himself up. So, these are lived. They're not learnt. Characteristics are lived, not learnt. And this evolution doesn't happen overnight. So, you know, of course, I could be thrown out of here now because you've come here to learn all these good things very quickly. You've put aside a certain amount of time and you want to get that experience, get that knowledge and leave. But actually, that's the skill side. And actually, participating in an MBA also requires perseverance, courage, hard work, commitment. So you develop those characteristics. But the real life experiences happen outside, in your business life. And let me make a point here. Characteristics are not developed inside the office. Of course, partly they are. But everything that I'm talking about here exists in your personal life. And it exists outside of the office. Now we get to talk about the crucibles. This is not my idea. Crucibles, sorry, I have to go over here because I can't see the clock. Crucibles, I ran across this in some reading. And this is not my bright idea. This is somebody else's bright idea. But it works for me. The concept of a crucible was, for an alchemist, was that you took lead, you put it in your crucible, it became gold. Well, that was one of the theories. Of course it didn't. But that's the idea of a crucible. It is a period, a transition between one material and the next. And in this crucible of life, it is a moment in your life when you see, every day you have new experiences. And every day, in some way, you are growing, hopefully. I mean, you can choose not to grow, but generally, we're all getting experiences and we're all growing. But these crucible moments are moments where you don't change a little bit, you actually change a lot. And the person coming out of this experience is a very different person from the one going in. And as you come out of this experience, and we'll talk about what these are, you feel in some way that you're looking at the world with different eyes because you've absorbed the lessons of the experience. It is also part of this concept that it allows you, going through this process, allows you to adapt better. It causes you to be more capable of change, just by the fact that you've already gone through a very formative experience. Once you've gone through this, you are able, because you've gone through it, to talk to other people in a way that you can engage them. I mean, frankly, if I was 25 and I was setting out on my career and I was the arrogant young man that I used to be, I wouldn't be able to talk about this stuff at all, even if I read it in a book. Because it's not me. I'm reading somebody else's experience. The point about this is that it becomes yours when you have actually participated in it. It requires integrity. You can't. I used to have a boss in one of the banks who had this smile. I can't do it. I'm not very good at smiling. But he had this smile. And he thought that when he ran around the bank and he would lunge at someone, he thought he was connecting with that person. Actually, everybody understood it was completely fake. Everybody understood that this was just his performance. And the more he did it, the more irritated people got. So you can only do these sort of things with reality, integrity. And going through this stuff, by its nature, causes you to have a tougher approach, makes you more resilient. Now, not all of these things are the same. They come in different varieties, colors. The three are new territory, reversal, and suspension. And each of these, this is what I like about this theory, is that it deals with the fact that not every one of these transformational experiences is the same. In the new territory, it basically is a very positive experience. On August the 1st, 1982, I was 27 years old. I was running the corporate bank for Citibank in Africa. I was the youngest resident vice president Citibank had appointed. They told me that my business was the most stable, profitable business in East Africa. And I was very relaxed. It was great fun. I was 27 and single. I lived, believe it or not, with tame giraffe in my garden. I could call them and they'd eat out of my hand. And I lived a perfect life. I was coming back from the discotheque at 3 in the morning, and I ran into a group of people waving to me. So I waved back. By the way, I used to wear a gun. I used to carry a gun. It was a groovy thing to do if you're 27. These people turned out not to be waving. They turned out to be waving with guns. Much bigger guns than my gun. And they were rebels who had taken over Nairobi. And I was put down in the ground with a big, because they found my gun. So they thought that I was some white security agent instead of just some 27-year-old who thought it was cool to have a gun. And I got into a very tense situation with them. I negotiated a case of whiskey. Do not do this. If you're in this situation and you are caught in a coup, do not negotiate a case of whiskey. Why? Because the people that you've negotiated it with who have the big guns come home to your house. They give you an armed escort. They then drink the case of whiskey, and now you have a group of extremely drunk men with guns who think they're your new best friends. It's a very bad idea. But what I learned, because the business environment changed from night to morning, was, and in a very bad way, cross-border risk, portfolio risk, management risk, physical risk, continuity risk. These were names of things that I'd read about in a book. And suddenly, these were very real. And that new crucible, because it certainly was a crucible, was fabulous. I loved it. I was good at it. I was calm. I understood what the situation was. I developed an action plan. I executed it. And Citibank saw that and made me their crisis manager for the next 15 years. New territory. Nothing could be better. So what's this next one? The next one is not so much fun. I'm given my new job at Citibank in Russia. And it's the first time I'm given a leadership job, not a management job. In 1995, when we were creating Citibank, there were no bankers that were relevant, because Soviet bankers had nothing to do with capitalism. And we were setting up a capitalist bank. So we had to find expatriates from all over the world who, by the way, did not want to come to Moscow, which at the time in 95 was quite a violent place. And so the only people we could find to bring to Russia were people who had no alternative at the time. These were not the A-list players. Actually, and if I think about this, why was I here? But these were not the A-list players. And we brought them in, and we hired a bunch of young Russians who knew nothing about banking at all, but knew a lot about Russia, and who were enthusiastic. And so we had this terrible disconnect between expatriates who knew nothing about Russia, but a lot about banking, and Russians who knew everything about Russia and nothing about banking. And I was ruling this very difficult oil and water kind of situation, and I was doing it the way that Citibank had always taught me to do it, which is as a crisis manager. I was telling people what to do. And I failed. I failed to be a leader. I was a manager. In fact, my boss's boss explained it to me in a very good way. He said, for 20 years, Stuart, you were the best gladiator we had at Citibank. Every time we had a problem in the arena, you would pick out your sword and you would, like Russell Crowe, kill everybody in sight. You were smarter, you were tougher, you were more dynamic, you were very effective. And because of that, we made you Caesar. And we put you in the box. And all you had to do was this. But every time you found that there was a fight in the forum, in the ring, you'd leap out of the box, jump into the arena, and participate in the fighting. Because that's what you were used to doing. This was truly a failure. And I was removed early from my posting here to go to Puerto Rico. Okay, can you imagine? I'm the head of Citibank Russia, and my new job is the head of, where is it? Puerto Rico. Very public. Very, very unpleasant. That's a reversal. The final one of these is suspension. Now, suspension happens when your life before has changed and you're in a new part of your life. And as I was saying earlier, this can be as much in your private life. All of these happen in your private life. So suspension can be if you become medically very sick. It can be if you break up, if you have a divorce with your wife. if you are in a world where something in that world has changed in a way that it's not going to change back again. For me, my current job as advisor has caused me to go through a crucible of suspension. For 14 years, I was the boss. Of course, I wasn't the ultimate boss. But here in Russia, I was the boss. Actually, that's not true, because Mr. Deripaska thought he was the boss, and he was. But I was the boss of the bank. And every meeting I went to was my meeting, if I wanted it to be. And people would form a queue outside my office, almost literally, waiting for me to make decisions. Today, I'm an advisor. Nobody's waiting outside my door. Oh, they are, because my door is opposite the toilet. So some of them wait, quite anxiously. But they don't wait for me. I have to get used to this new environment. And I am very pleased to say that because I've had plenty of experiences of reversal, I've actually found this to be a very easy crucible to manage. Now, this is a soundtrack. I don't think it's going to work, actually. So I don't think it's going to work, not because of it's my problem. This is a soundtrack I must get this sorted out so that I can play it. It is actually the announcement on that morning in 1982, where there is a soundtrack of the rebels who took over the city, and they're saying, "Congratulations, Kenya, you are free. We have taken over the government. Everything is fine. Everything is safe." And it's the sound of two things. The first is my first crucible. And the second, which actually is something I like talking about in another class on risk, which is Black Swan, which is that it was an event that came, as it were, from nowhere and that changed everything about the business, which is a very interesting, because in Black Swans, you don't forecast them, you react to them. But that's another story for another day. So here I talk about different things that have happened to me, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is my life. And let me talk about one though, because I've had, these are all my reversals, and there's probably more actually. It's a long list. But let me talk about the one which is the first junior role at Delta Bank. Now, it's actually in 2001. So by 2001, I was already a very seasoned banker. And I had been the head of Citibank here in Russia. And even my role in little Puerto Rico, I had 2,000 people reporting to me. So when I say it was a small business, it wasn't that small. And I sat in America. Oh, and the year 2000, when I left Citibank, the same day I joined, 25 years earlier, 22nd of September, that year happened to be the year I got divorced. And I couldn't work out what was worse, a divorce from Citibank after 25 years or a divorce from my wife after 5. Both were pretty unpleasant. And actually, when I talk about the outside world and the inside world, I was enjoying a reversal in both. And so I sat in my house in Princeton and I drank. This was my problem solver. And after about 6 months of that, I realized this was not going anywhere. And a friend of mine who had been the branch manager for Citibank in St. Petersburg when we opened in Italianskaya Square in '96, my branch manager had found himself a tiny bank. I think there were maybe 100 people in this bank. and maybe it had assets of $70 million. It wasn't really a bank. And he called me up as I sat there in Princeton, and he said, "Stuart, do you want to come back to Russia to be my advisor?" Now, this is my branch manager asking if I would like to be his advisor in a bank with 125 people in it and almost no assets. Can you imagine what your ego goes through when you think you're the most important banker in Russia because you're running the world's biggest bank, and then your branch manager offers you this opportunity to be his advisor, not even to run the bank. That would have been kind of like bad enough, but I was going to be the advisor to the guy running the bank. And actually, when I arrived in the bank, I did actually get an office. It's the only time in my life, I have to say, with no windows. I mean, it was in the basement with no windows. This was different from the corner office at Citibank. But I had learned a lesson. Sorry.
One question.
Yeah. They were part of... Yes, but Delta Bank then was Delta Capital Fund, which was part of the US-Russia Investment Fund, and it was a sister to Delta Credit, and it was actually a shell. Delta Credit that was run by James Cook, Delta Fund that was partly run by Kirill Dmitriev from RDIF was the holding company, and Delta Bank was this tiny little bank. But yes, it was the sister bank. And actually, the end of the story is that Alexander Grigoriev, who went on to be the CEO of Ingerstrach, came into Delta Bank and managed to sell this tiny little bank to GE Money for a lot of money. But I'm talking about 2 years earlier to that, 2001, it was a tiny bank going nowhere at the time. There was no opportunity. It didn't seem like there was any opportunity. It did, though, however, it was, to be fair, owned by the US-Russia Fund, which was starting Delta Credit and Delta Leasing and was quite interesting. But the job I had was in the basement advising my branch manager how to run this bank.
Yeah, but there was IBC, Investment Banking Corporation.
No, not at that time. No. This is 2001. That came later. Yeah. No, it wasn't. 2001, all there was, 125 people, about $70 million of assets, nada, nothing at that point.
As I remember, I worked for IBC.
Uh-huh.
It was 2001 or something. Second, they had some film operations.
Okay, but this, when I'm talking about the day I joined in 2001, it was what I'm describing. Sure. And the point of my story is I had learned, I'm proud, because I had learned my lesson from that reversal, which is that you cannot allow yourself to let your ego get in the way. So this is merely to say that these sort of crucibles happen outside with relationships, you know, even moving or death of a loved one. These are all crucibles. So here's some practical advice. Here is a little practical advice for you. Reject rejection. You have to understand that your own worth comes from you, not from the reflected view of you by other people. Do not take this as, oh, I'm suggesting you ignore other people's opinions. You shouldn't. What I'm saying is, though, that your sense of self-worth needs to come from within you. And sometimes you need to ignore the views of others. And also, in this environment, you have to understand the other's motivations, because it may well be that if you don't understand them, you won't understand why they're rejecting you. And this is the thing about church. So this, I don't know if you can translate that. Can you see that okay? Can you translate it? Okay. Accept responsibility for your actions. If the first thing that happens, by the way, in a reversal, one of the first things is, hey, it wasn't my fault. It was that idiot. It was my boss. It was the guy that worked for me. It was everybody but me. You know, who were the two worst people in your business career? The idiot that was your predecessor and the fool that was your successor. So if you allocate blame to others, it's an easy way out, but you learn nothing. They may have participated in this situation, but were they truly responsible for it? And critically, if you don't take responsibility for this yourself, then of course there's nothing to learn from it, is there? So one of the first steps, if you're going to learn from failure, is to accept responsibility for it. He's mowing his lawn. He may be surrounded by water, but he's going to have a perfect lawn. Failure is temporary, and it will pass. You know, it's almost impossible for somebody who's going through the process of failure to believe this. I'm sure you've heard people say, time heals everything. And I'm sure when people told you that, you probably thought, don't be ridiculous, I'm in great pain, it will never pass. But once you've gone through this a couple of times, it's not that you should think, well, nothing is a failure because nothing is forever. Quite the contrary. But I think that you have to understand that failure is a process. But it will not feel like it at the time, I guarantee. And one of the things you've got to do is, when you're in this washing machine, you've got to find things you do control. You know, and they may be short term. But, you know, not that I'm a perfect example, but exercise. You know, do things that you can control, because other things that you can't control, you can't control. And, you know, I'll tell you a quick story. I turned 60 this year, and one of the things I wanted to do for my birthday was write a book. So I wrote a book, and it has 19 stories, one from each country and 8 stories from Russia. And the first story in my book is about my father, who was a general practitioner. He was a doctor, and he practiced medicine until he was 83. And he was a clever little man, and he took cash from his patients sometimes and didn't pay tax on it. And he opened a safe deposit box, and he put that cash into the safe deposit box every month for 40 years. And when he was 82, and he was retiring finally, he took me with him to the bank, and we went to the safe deposit box, and he was incredibly proud because he was giving his son this box full of money that he'd been saving for 40 years. He opened the box. Inside the box was money that was no longer legal, tender. It was no longer valid. You know, like you used to have 100,000 ruble notes. Well, it was no longer valid. It was just a lot of paper. Of course, I never told my father, and I thanked him very much. And when I had a son, 16 years ago, I started writing diaries. And for 16 years, I've written a diary, and I put my diary in that box. And then 2 years ago, I realized that when my son comes to open it, he's going to be so pissed off that I put some gold in the box as well, because otherwise it was going to be too much of a disappointment. But this business of writing it out Unfortunately, he's going to read a lot of diaries in which, frankly, I'm just venting, how I feel. I'm not very proud of those. Go to the gym. Talk to a close circle of friends, but for Christ's sake, for heaven's sake, don't be a bore. Because your problems are your problems, they're not everybody else's. And if you spend all of your time telling everybody else about your problems, pretty soon you'll find that nobody really wants to hang out with you. That is different from having a support group who will help you. I love that picture. Set realistic expectations. Okay? I mean, I'm not going to be on the basketball team. If you set unrealistic expectations, you will never reach your goal. But make sure your goals are challenging. Don't go to the other extreme. Don't say, well, tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up and brush my teeth. That's not a goal. Build on your strengths, not your weaknesses. If you spend your time focused on what it is you can't do, in a way it's good because at least you realize what you can't do, but it won't pull you out from this hole that you're in. And also, if you focus on positives, it creates a virtuous circle where you feel better about yourself. Can you translate that? If you keep doing that, it's going to keep hurting. If you run at the wall and then it hurts, and then you run at the wall and it hurts, and then you run at the wall and it hurts, get the point. Stop running at the wall. If you don't vary your approach, you're going to have the same input and the same output. And that's the old saying, those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat it. And also, don't assume that you're going to find this solution the first time around. It's going to take time. But make sure that you don't do the same thing again. That's the main thing. If you failed at something, accept responsibility for the failure, analyze what it is that went wrong, and do something different. Build a strong set of external friends. I have to say one of my proudest achievements, I guess, is that at my 60th birthday, I had 100 people. And in that room, there probably weren't more than about 25 bankers, or people that were related to bankers. Everybody else had something else that they did, whether they were fashion people or photographers or musicians or whatever. But the fact is, find ways of diversifying your environment. And the reason I say that is that if all of your friends are in the same business that you're in, don't be surprised when, if that business fails, you get nothing in terms of support, because if you've invested everything in that business, then everybody else is also invested in that business. And if you are having a tough time, everybody's going to be lined up in the same way. If you have friends that are not involved in your business, they're really not going to care. And they're great people to provide comfort. Yeah. And when you have this group of friends, this is just, I'm sure you all know this anyway, but friends are not for the good times. By which I mean, it's not just you want to be with them when they're having good times, it's that you want to be with them full stop, good and bad. Okay. Critically, get back in the game. That was my decision to come back to Delta Bank. That was my learning, was I wasn't going to get offered a job in Russia drinking heavily in Princeton, New Jersey. But I'll tell you another story. At the same time that this opportunity to come back to Russia came up, I got an opportunity to go for an interview with a major international bank. And I went into this meeting, and we started the meeting with and this was the head of HR for the international bank. And after 20 minutes, this guy said, Stuart, stop. You are the single worst interview candidate I have ever met in 20 years. He said, you have managed to do all of the things that we teach people not to do. You've talked about your personal circumstances, my divorce. You've talked about how Citibank didn't understand you, how you didn't, everybody it was the idiots around you that were he said, you have to go away and get your head in the right place. So this business of getting back into the game only works if you're ready. There's no point in, going through this reversal process and immediately saying, oh, I've got to get back in the game, and then really not having a positive attitude. I don't know how many people saw The Omen, but this is the girl in The Omen, and her head has turned around. So there's no point in going and trying to reconnect when your head's in the wrong place. So, practical steps. Rejection. Self-image is important. Take the blame. Don't blame others. Failure is temporary. It will pass. Just understand that it's a period. Set realistic expectations. Build on your strengths, not your weaknesses. Vary your approaches. If you do the same thing, you'll get the same output. Build a strong network of external friends and get back in the game. Bounce back. Resilience is the key. It's not how you fall down, it's how you pick yourself up. And it's a wonderful opportunity to improve your game, but only if you're listening. But only if the lessons are understood. And that, I think, is where I said I'd stop this part of it. Yep. Can I ask if there's any questions or comments? Then I'll move into other topics. Yeah. Okay. What a great question. I think the issue about success. Now, and in fact, actually, you've just done which was the obverse of what the guy in Oxford did. You've given me the opportunity to talk about success, which is very kind of you. The fact is that success is somewhat of a drug, and that if you are positively reinforced during this period of success, it gives you the confidence to move on and make bold decisions that will actually allow you to continue to be successful. But the most dangerous part of success, and of course I'm going to say this with my rear view mirror, looking at my career, the periods when I was the most successful, I allowed myself to become arrogant. I allowed myself in that period to believe my own PR, as they say. And I think success, the most successful people I know have certain common traits, I think. Not all of them, but they tend to be extremely active listeners. They tend to be people who, when you meet them, are focused entirely on you and what you're saying and understanding your point of view and wanting to learn from you, rather than people who believe that they know the answer and they need to tell you what it is. And my skill set during my period as a crisis manager for one of the world's largest banks was as good as it could ever be. And I probably did know more than most of the people around me. And I probably did have to take unilateral action in crisis situations. And I was extremely goal-oriented and efficient. But real success, which is able to be maintained, requires an ability to keep your ego under control. You need the ego to use the ego, not let the ego use you. And I have plenty of friends of mine who have, over time, been extremely successful. And one of their most beneficial characteristics is that they've been able to keep their ego under control, whilst retaining the power that their ego will provide them in terms of motivation. So, I mean, I'm not quite sure if I've answered the question, but to me at least, being truly successful is being successful in a way that the success doesn't change your self-perception, that you actually maintain a stability. Other questions, please. In Russian as well. По-русски, если нужно. Do you want a question? Thanks. No, I think one of the most difficult, I'm going to try and answer the question. But before I do, I'd say that one of the most difficult pieces of advice is how to deal with a bad boss. I have in my career had several opportunities to encounter, and this isn't me blaming them, but genuinely bad bosses. And the problem, for me at least, was that my reaction to it was confrontation. And what I've learned from my life experience is never confront directly your boss. Because if you directly confront your boss, there's going to be a winner and a loser. And you're going to be the loser in most situations. It's particularly true if you're in a big multinational. It's clearly true if your boss happens to be the shareholder. You are not going to win the argument. And then the question is, well, if you're not going to win the argument, does that mean you should always say yes? And that's just as dangerous, because that will lead you down roads where you lose your own self-respect, and you may lose your way and integrity, which is worse. So in a situation where, you've described, you have confrontation, your boss is not acknowledging success, you have to make a decision. First of all, can you come at that a different way so that it's not confrontational? I'm right, you're wrong. I mean, in many situations, unfortunately, it may be that they say one thing and you completely disagree, and at that point you have to say to yourself, can I live in this world where I'm in tension, or do I have to change where I am? I think over a long period of time, you have to change where you are. Because if you stay in that position, it will erode your own self-confidence, it will erode your ability to be efficient. Because what you're doing is apparently not valued by the people to whom you report. So my advice in a situation where you're not being valued is, first of all, do not directly confront it and make it a win-lose. Because if you make it a win-lose, you'll lose. But that if, having tried to put out the facts, And if they still don't work, you have to take a look in the mirror and say, can I live with this situation? If you can't, you move on. You have to adjust your own sense of success, your own self-worth. And if it's bad enough, move on, because if it's not changing, it won't end happily. I'm not sure I've given you an answer. It's just my experience has been, if you are in that corner, and it's a very uncomfortable corner. Now, I have to tell you that when I worked for Deripaska, I fundamentally disagreed with many, many things. And my direct supervisor was a woman called Olga Zinovevia, and she's now the deputy CEO at Interos. And even though she and I fought pretty much every other day, we did it with respect for each other. And she won pretty much most of the arguments, not all of them. But I understood that I either accepted her point of view or I had to move on. And I have to say, from her point of view, I've subsequently learnt that because I put up a tough fight, and I never let it be emotional. That's the other thing. If you're in a situation where it's confrontation between you and somebody else, and you become emotional, you've lost that argument. Emotion never won an argument. And so I always approach those discussions from a logical point of view, and sometimes I won and sometimes I lost, but I was able to keep going. If you're in a situation where you can't win any arguments and you're not being valued, find somewhere else to be. That's my advice. More questions?
Были ли у вас мысли в кризисные моменты в вашей жизни изменить вообще направление деятельности, ну или области профессиональной? И второй вопрос, какая связь вы наблюдали по своему опыту изменения профессиональной области и личной жизни?
Both good questions. I think there were at least, well, two occasions where I wanted to get out of my banking world. I started a restaurant in Ireland in 1981 in Dublin, and I was commuting from Kenya to Dublin. It was never going to work. By the way, anybody that opens a restaurant, you might as well take your money and burn it first. It's going to save you time. So that was the first occasion. And then in 2000, oh really? Good. In 2000, I started a fashion company called the Little Black Dress Company. It was a brilliant idea because we didn't have to worry about the inventory because it was all black. So we didn't have to worry, what the fashion was next year because it was always going to be black. Unfortunately, we tried to sell it online too early, and we couldn't do the sales online, and it too went bust. So, and I guess the final one was that I was due diligence expert for a venture capital house in London, where every month I'd get a package, and it would have, like Mission Impossible, it would have an air ticket and a destination, and I never knew where it was, and I'd fly and I'd look at different banks. And wonderfully, I ended up being the director of a Cuban bank in Havana. The only problem was that I was also the chairman of a bank in Russia, Delta Bank. So all I had to, and my son was living in New York, and the house I built was in Puerto Rico. So I had a really simple schedule. I flew directly from Moscow to Havana. Then I went to Mexico because I couldn't fly to America. Then I went to New York. Then I flew to Puerto Rico with my 2-year-old son. And when we'd finished our vacation, I moved back to New York, and then I flew back to Moscow. And I did that every 6 weeks for a year, at the end of which I understood that perhaps it wasn't the most efficient way of living my life. So, now, the second question was, how has that changed me? Is that correct? I think the most important change I had in my life was when my son was born. And all these other things really don't compare to being responsible for another individual. I think this process of these changes creates a perspective which changes who you are. And I think it's a very positive thing. Does that answer your question?
Вот на второй вопрос хотелось
Sorry.
по поводу второго вопроса, который я задавал. Мне хотелось понять, есть ли некая корреляция между личной жизнью и профессиональной деятельностью. То есть успехи в личной жизни, например, они с успехом.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. I don't know about you, but in my professional life, I was spending 12 hours a day in the office. So how I felt about myself during those 12 hours was reflected to a large extent, how I felt about myself outside of that environment. And in a period of success, you tend naturally to be more attractive. You know, let's face facts. If you have a self-image of failure, you know, people smell that. People, you know, if it's almost a chemical reaction. Somebody who isn't able to exude at least some self-confidence, who is at that period where they doubt everything, including themselves, those people aren't attractive. And that gets, and then critically, that is the period where you need people who you've known for a long period who put this in context. Because if you've known people for a long period and they know you outside of the context of your work, they will see this as a temporary thing in a way that perhaps you can't yourself. And those are the people, which is why I say have this wide external group, who are able to carry you through these periods. And I'm not going to try and sugarcoat how unpleasant these periods are. My only message is try and recognize them for what they are and make this cycle time between the event, the reversal, the understanding of it, the lessons from it, and putting your head in the right position and moving on, make that period as short as possible. But even if it's short, you still have to go through the process. Another question.
You talked primarily about personal failure in the individual side.
Hang on just a sec, I think for the translation.
You have talked primarily about individual failure, failure in the individual.
Yes.
But could you say a little bit about failure in an organization in the sense that, as I see it, you don't create an organization where some failure is possible. You will have a very difficult time getting your people to be willing to take the necessary risks.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about how you can get your people to understand that failure is not necessarily a disaster for the organization, but it can be turned around. It can be used.
Yeah. I mean, I think the point here, actually we were talking before the class about cultural issues in business. And one of the difficulties, by the way, before I say what I'm about to say, remember I love this country and the people in it. So any criticism I have or any comments I have about Russian culture or business culture are because I love being here, but my personal perception. And my personal perception in Russia is failure is not tolerated. Failure is really, you're a winner or you're a loser. You win the deal or you lose the deal. You know, and this is reflected, unfortunately, all the way to the top. That there is, compromise isn't something that comes naturally in a Russian context. And, you know, even if you look at innovation, before we get into organizational behavior, you know, one of the reasons why innovation is so complicated in Russia is, as anybody will tell you, to be a good venture capitalist, to be in the innovation field, you have to fail more than you succeed. Well, I don't say you have to fail, but you have to be prepared to fail more than you succeed. If you're a venture capitalist and everything that you ever do is always successful, well, you are either really lucky or you haven't really been using venture capital in situations where you have maximum return. Because in its nature, venture capital carries a high risk and a high return. And the problem in Russia is particularly if you put that underneath a state structure, which is driven by the need to account to the budget for all spending, how do you account to the budget for losses in investments where you're meant to be making money? And the answer is, it's in the nature of the business that you should be allowed to fail. So when you say, how do you create an organization which allows failure within it so that it can grow, I think it is this business of being prepared to understand that any venture that has high upside potential carries a significant downside. And you've got to be prepared to accept the downside, whether it's in terms of, you see, even in HR terms, you've got to be prepared to take risks on people. You know, here's a junior person, we're going to give them a big job, we don't know if they're up to it, you provide all the necessary support, but maybe they fail. And if your attitude to failure is, I'm sorry, if you failed, you're out, then it's very difficult for those people to ever really grow, because they're in a culture where if they failed in that particular task, they won't have the confidence to come back and try again. So, I have, and this is a longer conversation, I have run Russian businesses from a Western point of view, and I've encountered enormous blocks, barricades, because I had learned the importance of giving people an opportunity to succeed, but not killing them if they fail. And unfortunately, the environment isn't very receptive to that. So it's sort of more like work in progress, I think, in terms of culture. Yes, please do. Let me, do people have to, I see people leaving, do people actually physically have to go at 2? I mean, I don't want to keep them. We should stop at 2, basically. Yes, okay, no, sure. Okay, go ahead.
Специально проводимое правительство Центробанком России целью как-то компенсировать потери сионистских экспортеров за счет такого курса рубля по отношению к доллару. Хотелось бы ваше мнение услышать, вы вообще как вы оцените политику ЦБ по отношению к рублю?
Here's an opportunity to find myself on the next plane out of here, never to come back. I'll give you my because this is a very complicated question, and there's no very simple answer to it. In January of this year, the Russian economy faced a major problem, which is that the reform process had not produced the diversification that was necessary. Ulakayev, the Minister of the Economic Development, acknowledged that there was a very poor response to the small and medium-sized enterprise initiative, that there needed to be more focus on diversification, and that Russia was too dependent on, too dependent on extractive industries, and B, was operating at full capacity. And an economy that's operating at full capacity requires investment, because the only way that you can grow GDP at full capacity is for additional investment. And because there was no either domestic or foreign direct investment in any sizable quantity, the ability to raise GDP at that point was limited. When sanctions need to be understood on three levels. There is the immediate impact of sanctions, and by immediate I mean direct and indirect. So when you sanction VTB for capital raising above 30 days, you're not just sanctioning VTB, you're sanctioning every Russian bank in terms of its ability to raise capital, because any sanction to a country is contagious, and it affects both the entity that's directly sanctioned, but it also impacts, obviously, the risk, the cross-border risk for the country. So that's the first element of sanction. The second element of sanction, which is the counter-sanction, so there's the sanction and the counter-sanction. In the case of the counter-sanctions, this imported inflation into an environment where inflation was already running well ahead of the target set by the central bank. So the central bank has a problem, which is how to control inflation, how to try and defend the ruble in an environment where where there's full employment and you have to bring in investment to increase GDP. And this is a very, very difficult thing to do, because to protect the currency and to control the inflation, you increase the interest rate. But when you increase the interest rate, the existing businesses' cash flow is very significantly diminished, and interest rate rises does not compensate for political cross-border risk. So you can increase that interest rate all you want, and it isn't going to convince people to reinvest into the country whilst there is still a cross-border risk. And the third part of the sanctions, which is frankly, I think, the one that should worry us the most, is that these sanctions are incrementalizing. I don't know how you do that. But they build one on top of the other. And to give you one example of that, well, two examples. One is you reduce the capacity of the country to maintain energy production at the rates that it currently has, because you prevent it from adding incremental high-tech production capacity. But equally, and this is where I think there's real danger, is if Russia is prevented from accessing Western capital markets, and it believes that they are closed not just in the short term but in the long term, then I don't see why Russia would pay off all its external debt. Because what's happening here is that there's 750 billion of external debt, and all of that external debt is due to be refinanced. None of it will be refinanced, or very, very little will be refinanced in the foreign markets, which means all of that debt has to come back on shore as rubles. The only banks that are capable of doing this are the state banks, because there is pressure on the capital already of the private sector. It means that the state bank balance sheets will increase in size. But eventually, this will erode the foreign exchange reserves of the country. And you only play this game if you want to participate in this game in the long term. I pay you back, Not because necessarily I want to pay you back, but because at some stage in the future, when I want to borrow from you again, I have that credibility. If we get into an environment where America, say, passes law, not sanctions, against Russia, and these capital markets look like they're closed in the medium term, then the reaction from the Russian authorities may be quite severe, and I don't want to go further than that. I think we're in a very we've run out of time, but luckily, but we're in a very complex environment, which is different from anything else we've seen, because this is an environment driven by politics, not economics. And when an environment is driven by politics, not economics, actions can be taken that have massive economic consequences for reasons nothing to do with the economy. A long answer, but I'm sorry, I didn't want to talk about central bank because it's not an area I'm comfortable talking about. Sorry? I'm afraid we've got more of this. And you should take my course on crisis management if I ever get around to teaching it. So, because I can tell you about them. I think I'm done. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.